What if the heroes you admired, the legends you grew up hearing about, were really only part of the story?
Hmm.
What if the real history, the stuff underneath, was way more complicated, maybe even brutal, contradictory?
That's a powerful question to start with.
Well, today that's exactly what we're exploring. We're diving into a really remarkable book, Cult of Glory: The Bold and Brutal History of the Texas Rangers by Doug J. Swanson.
A fascinating read.
It is. And our mission here is to, pull out the key insights, uncover some surprising facts, and really try to understand the complex reality behind one of America's most iconic, maybe the most iconic law enforcement groups.
And I think this book really challenges you, the listener, to think critically about how narratives get built. Why do certain stories stick?
Right.
You'll get a unique perspective on how a powerful image can be crafted, and maybe more importantly, what that image can sometimes hide. It's a look at history that might just change how you see information, even today.
Absolutely. And as we get into these complex historical waters, just a reminder to check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel.
Good point.
Yeah, it's where we offer AI book analysis, all designed to spark deeper reflection and, rational thought on all sorts of topics.
Definitely worth checking out.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The Rangers trace their origins back to 1823. What does the book tell us about how they actually started as this sort of irregular militia in Mexican Texas?
It's pretty revealing, actually. Swanson points out that for decades, they had no uniform, no flag, no badge, nothing official like that.
Early decades?
Yeah. They were essentially young guys, volunteers looking for adventure. But what's fascinating is how quickly an image formed around them, even without the official trappings.
So the image came first, almost.
In a way, yes. They got labeled the fightingest men on Earth pretty early on, and that perception was absolutely critical to building the whole myth, the bold knights in cowboy hats idea.
Bringing law to a lawless land.
Exactly. That whole narrative of taming a violent, lawless, and uncivilized land, the book shows how that myth started taking shape almost from day one, even when the reality was much scrappier.
That's wild. But, okay, the book doesn't paint a rosy picture of that early reality. What did justice actually look like back then before, proper courts and police?
Well, that's a key question the book tackles. What was justice? Without formal systems, settlers often fell back on what Swanson calls backcountry justice.
Which sounds ominous.
It was often incredibly brutal and swift.
Yeah.
The book gives examples like Robert Kuykendall and his group executing two guys they suspected of murder.
Okay.
And then they cut off their heads and stuck them on poles as a warning.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly law and order.
Not even close. It was raw, public, meant to instill fear. It shows this huge contrast between the later heroic image and the, frankly, barbaric methods sometimes used early on.
And this brutality wasn't just for suspected criminals, right? The book talks about Stephen F. Austin settlers and the Karankawa tribe. There's a specific battle in 1830.
Yes, that's a really stark example of the violence of the time. The book details an attack by about 60 Texians, considered sort of proto-rangers on a Karankawa camp.
And the outcome?
It was horrific. According to the book, around 50 Karankawa men, women, and children were killed. One account even said the river turned red with blood.
Oh, my God.
And the survivors. Some were enslaved. Some women were taken as housekeepers. It's basically ethnic cleansing. And the crucial point the book makes is how this kind of extreme violence was either justified at the time or just wiped from the heroic story that grew up later.
So the order they were supposedly bringing was built on that.
That's a strong implication, yes.
Yeah.
The foundation was often violent.
Which is miles away from the heroic image. And speaking of heroes, let's talk about figures like John Coffey Hayes. He became legendary. The book mentions stories like Enchanted Rock.
Ah, Hayes, yes. He's central. These stories, like Enchanted Rock, where he supposedly won this incredible victory against impossible odds, were absolutely vital to the myth-making.
Whether they were strictly true or not.
Exactly. True or not, they cemented Hayes as this gun-toting, dead-aim Superman, the archetype of the Ranger.
But the book offers another perspective, too.
It does. It contrasts these heroic tales with observations from outsiders, like a European nobleman, Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels. He apparently saw the American volunteers in Texas as undisciplined and capable of crueler deeds.
So a very different picture.
Completely.
Yeah.
It really highlights how glory often depends on who's telling the story, right? The internal view versus the external perception could be wildly different.
And a big part of their reputation, their fighting ability, came down to technology, didn't it? The Colt revolver.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
The Patterson Colt 5-shooter was a game changer. The book really emphasizes this. Having multiple shots when your opponents likely had single-shot weapons, that gave them a massive advantage in close fights.
And that fed the legend, too.
Definitely. It wasn't just a practical advantage, it became part of the mystique. Swanson notes that Mexican soldiers started attributing almost magical powers to the guns, yet believing the bullets could, curve around corners and hunt people down. It shows how a real technological edge can get exaggerated into something almost supernatural, feeding right into that cult of glory.
Okay, let's move forward a bit. The book gets into the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant called it a wicked war.
He did, and he noted the huge civilian cost. Villages burned.
How did the Rangers fit into that conflict? What was their reputation then?
It's fascinating. General Zachary Taylor, who commanded U.S. forces, apparently had mixed feelings. The book quotes him recognizing their bravery in battle, but also saying they were uncontrollable. He reportedly said he was glad to have them in a fight, but never before or after.
Why not?
Because, in his words, they tended to disgrace their colors and their country with extensive depredations and outrages upon peaceful inhabitants.
So effective fighters, but brutal.
Exactly. That's the paradox the book keeps returning to. They were seen as invaluable in combat, but also as a kind of moral liability. It just added to their fearsome image.
And the book mentions specific figures like Captain Mustang Gray, the menslayers.
Yeah, Mustang Gray is quite a character in the book, known for dancing, drinking, and killing. Swanson highlights this really chilling irony.
Which is
Gray apparently spent hours dancing with Mexican women, while at the same time, his men were brutalizing their countrymen.
wow. That says a lot.
It really encapsulates this distorted idea of payback that the book explores. Texans felt grievances with the Alamo Goliad that demanded retribution.
Right.
But this led to violence and incursions that, from the Mexican perspective, look like attacks by rampaging freebooters. The book even suggests Texan prisoners sometimes got better treatment than captured Mexican raiders did across the border. It really shows how history gets written by the victors, or at least how grievances can justify almost anything.
And that mentality, that payback idea, led to some horrific actions, like Captain James Callahan in Piedras Negras.
Callahan's raid is another grim example. He went supposedly to recover stolen horses and escaped slaves, found none, and ended up burning most of the Mexican village of Piedras Negras to the ground.
So burned it down.
Called it a wall of fire to cover his retreat. And the book adds this chilling follow-up. Later, back in Texas, he shot a neighbor's slave in the back with his 6-shooter over some perceived threat.
And what happened?
The local newspaper, the Seguini Mercury, actually admired the act, praised it.
That's terrifying.
It is. It shows how, within that cult of glory, acts of extreme violence could be reframed as displays of strength and necessary frontier justice, further cementing the myth.
Okay, so as Texas changes, becomes more settled, does the ranger role change too? The book mentions places like Brownsville being centers of vice, not just the frontier being lawless.
Yeah, their focus definitely shifted over time. The primary fight moved away from Native Americans and Mexicans towards chasing outlaws. Capturing Sam Bass, the train robber, was a big deal for them.
Why was that so important?
Well, according to the book, it helped restore some of their reputation after something called the Salt War.
Salt War.
Yeah, conflicts over control of salt flats near El Paso. Apparently, the Rangers didn't come out looking great. Their authority was challenged, their image took a hit. So catching bass was a way to regain some of that lost luster. It shows they had to keep proving themselves, adapting to new threats.
And in this era of chasing outlaws, you get figures like Captain L.H. McNelly. The book calls him a warlord and Christ figure. That's quite a description.
McNelly is another one of those deeply paradoxical figures, hugely effective, absolutely renowned, but also known for summary executions, even illegally crossing into Mexico to pursue cattle thieves.
And his reputation survived that.
Survived it. It seemed to thrive on it. The book notes that even President Lyndon Johnson later loved quoting one of McNelly's sayings, "Courage is a man who keeps on coming on."
So the ruthlessness became part of the legend.
Absolutely. It shows the incredible power of the myth. Even actions that were illegal or morally questionable got folded into this narrative of toughness and decisive action, reinforcing the cult.
But the book also uncovers events that are just purely tragic. The Porvenir Massacre in 1918. What happened there?
Porvenir's is.
Yeah.
It's a truly horrific incident described in the book. Following a raid on a nearby ranch, rangers and some local ranchers rounded up 15 unarmed Mexican men and boys from the village of Porvenir.
Unarmed.
Unarmed, and they executed them, just killed them all.
And the official reaction?
That's almost as disturbing. The initial response from the adjutant general was denial. Then, apparently due to political pressure, there was an investigation, but the book calls it a sham.
A cover-up.
Pretty much. The book highlights the testimony of an Army cavalryman, Robert Keel, who saw it happen as a boy. Years later, he documented it, reportedly weeping as he remembered the victims. He called it the biggest atrocity in the world. It really shows how the institution could protect itself, suppress the truth, even in the face of mass murder, all to maintain that image.
It's deeply disturbing. The book also tackles the Rangers' role, or lack thereof, during periods of intense racial violence, like the lynchings in Texas.
Yes, doesn't shy away from that at all. Texas had a terrible record with lynchings. The book describes the 1893 torture and burning alive of Henry Smith, a black man accused of horrific crimes. 10,000 people watched and cheered.
10,000?
Described as potentially the most horrible death ever inflicted on a human being. And the question is, where were the Rangers, the supposed upholders of law?
And what does the book say about figures like Frank Hamer, who later caught Bonnie and Clyde? He sometimes confronted lynch mobs, right?
He did, and the book acknowledges that. Hamer famously faced down mobs in Beaumont and Waco, even using a submachine gun, so there's that side. But Swanson also points out Hamer's contradictions. In 1931, for instance, he confiscated signs from communist marchers, signs that read, "Equality for the Negro masses."
So not exactly a consistent champion of equality.
It's complicated. It shows that even the heroes often operated within the prejudices of their time, and their actions weren't always clear-cut, good or bad. It messes with the simple hero narrative.
And the Mansfield School desegregation crisis in 1956 seems like another key example of this racial dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. A very revealing incident. Governor Shivers ordered the Rangers there not to stop the white mob blocking black students from entering the school.
What were their orders?
Their orders were to arrest any black students who actually tried to get into the school.
Arrest the victims, essentially.
Right. And the book points out the irony. Sergeant J. Banks, one of the Rangers there, later became part of this myth of the Rangers being impartial, even-handed.
Despite actively preventing desegregation.
Exactly. It's a stark example of how history gets rewritten, how the myth of the objective lawman was maintained even when the reality was the complete opposite, protecting the institution's image.
Moving towards more modern times, the book touches on things like the Rusk State Hospital riot in '56. A Ranger captain, Clint Crowder, was hailed as a hero.
Yeah, for unarmed courage in facing down inmates. But the book points out that the inmates' actual grievances, things like segregated units, were basically ignored in the heroic narrative.
And then there's Captain Alfred Alley in the '60s dealing with striking farm workers.
Alley is another really stark figure, known for brutality. The book mentions him beating one striker with a shotgun butt.
But how was he viewed?
That's the thing. Some people called him a psychopath. But others, especially supporters, saw him as a great law enforcement officer. Necessary toughness, you know?
The ends justify the means. Again.
It seems to be a recurring theme. It highlights how that cult of glory persisted, allowing or even celebrating methods that, viewed objectively, were just brutal, especially against marginalized groups.
And maybe the most bizarre, disturbing modern case the book covers is Henry Lee Lucas, the serial killer in the '80s.
That whole episode is chilling. Rangers actively encouraged Lucas to confess to hundreds of murders, many he likely didn't commit. They even helped connect him with writers and filmmakers to tell his story.
Why would they do that? Close cases.
That seems to be the implication. Closing cases, creating this narrative of incredible detective work. But the book reveals the flaw.
Which was?
A handwriting analyst within their own department, DPS, found evidence, a signed receipt, proving Lucas was 850 miles away when one of the murders he confessed to happened.
Proof he couldn't have done it.
Concrete proof. It just underscores the danger of relying only on confessions, the pressure to close cases, and how easily a false narrative can take hold and persist, even when contradicted by facts. A powerful endnote on image versus reality.
So, after digging through all this, what's the big takeaway? Cult of Glory pulls back the curtain, doesn't it? It shows this complex, often really uncomfortable history behind the shiny badge.
Definitely.
You see how the image was built, sometimes deliberately, and how the reality involved brutality, prejudice, actions that shaped Texas in profound ways, good and bad.
And I think connecting it to us today, it really hammers home how important it is to question the narratives we're given, even the ones we admire, the ones that feel like bedrock history. History is messy. It's complicated. And looking at those different conflicting perspectives like the one Swanson presents, it just makes our understanding richer. It pushes us to think more critically.
Absolutely. We really hope this discussion got you thinking and maybe offered a different angle on a familiar story. For more talks like this, ones that encourage reflection and rational thinking about fascinating books, do check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, and our other podcasts too.
Right.
And if you found this valuable, maybe learned something new, please think about subscribing to the channel.
Share it with a friend who loves history, maybe someone who grew up with those Ranger legends.
And you can grab a copy of Cult of Glory. It's a compelling read using the link in the description.
So as you think about these legends of the past, here's a final thought to leave you with. What other cults of glory, what other cherished narratives might we be unknowingly upholding right now in our own time?